Hello and good morning and welcome to the Mirror's Facebook Live. I'm Ben Glaze, the Daily Mirror's Deputy Political Editor, and I'm joined by Dan Bloom, the Mirror's online political editor. And we're going to be discussing the exams fiasco that has left Gavin Williamson facing calls to resign. Now, the Mirror's front page this morning, we carry calls from Keir Starmer where he's saying this is no way to run a country. He highlights what the government has done, not just over the exam scandal that left tens of thousands of teenagers with their exam results downgraded. He also points to the scandal over care homes during the coronavirus crisis and the ongoing fiasco that started back in March about testing. So Keir Starmer out on the offensive this morning with this exclusive Mirror op-ed. Now, Dan, what did you make of it?
Well, it's one of the most screeching and kind of drawn out U-turns that we've had of coronavirus so far, isn't it? So we had free school meals earlier this year. We had a whole kerfuffle over whether migrant workers in the NHS would have to pay a migrant surcharge to use the NHS. But this one, they really did dig their heels in. I was amazed by that interview that Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, gave on Saturday, where he said, that's it, no U-turns, I'm not U-turning, and said that the system that he's now introduced, where these students can all use their teachers' predicted grades, I sort of discredited, I can't remember the exact words he used, but sort of, you know, it was a terrible thing for grades in future years.
Yeah, the point that he was trying to make was that we need to cut down on grade inflation. And then by the interview he gave to the Times on Saturday, he said, you know, this is it, no U-turns. And then less than 3 days later, that's exactly what we've got, U-turns. I think one of the things that struck me about this U-turn more than the others was the sheer number of people affected. The free school meals element is obviously very important, but it didn't, even with Marcus Rashford sort of taking it on as a campaign, it had very brief cut through, if you like, whereas this, it's rumbling on because it's such a long issue in terms of the long-term effects that it would have had on the number of teenagers affected. And of course, it was, some of them were affected in the red wall that the Conservatives won their majority from when they demolished Labour back in that general election in December that Boris Johnson owes his majority to. So he's obviously up in Scotland this week on holiday, left Gavin Williamson to deal with all this. Williamson, you know, made out there were going to be no U-turns. And then after the weekend's headlines, and then particularly yesterday morning's headlines, I think they realised they had to act, really.
Well, that's why this is such a problem for Gavin Williamson personally, isn't it? Because, as you say, it's the real life problem of all these students who sort of losing out on their futures, and the political problem of, you know, downgrading a student based on an exam they didn't take is the exact opposite of levelling up and all the things the Tories want to do. And Gavin Williamson says he wasn't aware of this until the weekend, but actually, you know, we've been looking this morning at a report from a parliamentary committee led by a Tory MP that said in July that this was going to be a problem.
Well, the other thing, I mean, when they called off the exams back in the middle of March, you know, they had 5 months to sort out a system. Now, we see that Ofqual, the exams regulator, came up with various different algorithms, each giving a different standardization process. There were more than a dozen potential algorithms. And the Department for Education signed off on this one. I mean, can you imagine how bad the others would have been if this was the one they decided was the one that they wanted to go with? I mean, the others could have been even worse. But for Gavin Williamson to say that, you know, he only became aware of it over the weekend, I mean, he is the cabinet minister in charge of this. If he did only become aware of it over the weekend, if he's telling the truth, well, that's a dereliction of responsibility from what you should have been looking at for the past 5 months. You should have been on top of this. This and the reopening of schools, the delayed reopening of schools, I mean, those are the two biggest issues for him. And I think one of the reasons that he's not resigning today and hasn't been sacked over this yet is because they want to see what happens with the reopening of schools. Potentially he's got an opportunity for a reprieve if schools do open as planned in September. But if that goes wrong, then you know, he really is going to be in the firing line. We've got a question here from Mary Sullivan around.
Shall I take this one, or do you want to, Ben?
Well, I'll just read out. Why didn't they go with the teacher projection? Wouldn't that have made more sense? I mean, Dan, do you think it would have if they'd have done that originally?
Well, it clearly has done now, because they've identified that it's not a perfect option, but it's the least worst option. The problem with going with teacher projections in the first place, Mary, is that it created sort of grade inflation. So some teachers are more pessimistic and some are more optimistic. And what the government claimed was that more teachers are optimistic than the other way around. So a lot of students theoretically would have got grades that higher than they would have got if they'd sat exams. Now, the problem with that, of course, is they didn't sit exams. So you can't say that they would have got lower grades. And these students have gone through something that no students have been through before, really, in our modern history. That's 6 months without school, coronavirus, all the things that come along with that.
That's right. I mean, it is an unprecedented situation. We should keep stressing that no government has had to deal with this. And it's fair to say that whichever government was dealing with it, it probably wouldn't have been plain sailing all the way, with a government of whatever political colour. One thing with teachers' projection, of course, is now some teachers project them based on mocks. They present them based on year 12 exam results, which aren't quite mocks, but they're, this is how you're doing along the way. I remember when I was in Wales, which is where I grew up, we did these before devolution, and I didn't do particularly well in my mocks, but then I didn't take them seriously, because why would you bother with the mocks? They're not the real thing. As long as you focus on the real thing, that's the most important aspect. Now, of course, if I was doing it this time, and you're going to mocks, which at one point were, of course, going to form the basis for the appeals, well, then I'd have been left with egg on my face. In terms of my teachers' projections for my actual A-level results when I sat them, I was predicted 3 A's, and I actually ended up with 2 A's and a B. So if I underachieved in the exams, probably because of my own complacency or potentially laziness, at not revising hard enough for the one that I could have got an A and ended up getting a B. So I'd have benefited from having the teacher's assessment, the teacher's forecast, rather than the exams that I actually sat. But that's what these pupils now in this government U-turn, they're going to be scrambling for places today at universities, because of the downgraded situation. So many students will have accepted their second choice offers, believing they're not going to get into their first choice place because they didn't make the grades. Well, now there's this rush to try and get back their first choice places. And Dan, you spoke to the Education Secretary yesterday, he said that they expect universities to honour those offers they made originally.
Yeah, but he didn't actually. I said to him, are you going to offer any money or resources to help them do that? And he said, we expect the universities to honour their offers. Problem is, you can't magic up accommodation and lecture theatres, especially in the age of social distancing. So these unis might decide that they're full, and the government is asking them to make more room for all these students, but they might not have room.
And they have shifted the problem onto universities now. They've left it for universities to try and sort this out. There's this question here from Kerry Atterbury. Thank you for getting in touch, Kerry. Could this debacle see the end of an over-reliance on formal testing? Teachers are trained to continually assess their learners. What do you reckon, Dan? Is that the end of it for formal exams?
That's a difficult question, isn't it? I would be inclined to say no, because the government and people from many sides have said the best outcome we could have had would have been if those students could have sat those exams. On the other hand, though, perhaps coronavirus will have a bit of a cultural change. Perhaps this whole incident will have a bit of a cultural change, in which kind of the whole, I don't know, holistic experience of students is taken a bit more seriously, rather than focusing it and drilling it all down into a couple of hours in the middle of June in a hot, sweaty kind of gym where you have to sit at the table and, I'm sure we all have nightmares about that. Yeah. This
is what Michael Gove wanted when he was Education Secretary from 2010 in the coalition government. He was, the reforming zealot at education, at the Department for Education, who wanted to get rid of coursework, wanted to get rid of, or at least remove the significance of AS levels, and wanted this focus to be very much on linear exams. You sit at the end of your 2 years of A levels, piling pressure on where it does teach you to pile the pressure onto those exams. So you do revise for those final dramatic assessments. You know, I remember when I was doing A levels, the coursework, you'd get help along the way from your teachers with the coursework. Mine, I'd submit it, and then it would get you know, why don't you do this? Why don't you look at that? And then your grade would go up. So you do get advice. Now you are learning all along the way of doing that. Of course, those teachers who, as Kerry points out, they're trained to continually assess their learners. The teacher could see where I was going wrong, would say, you need to do this a bit more, and then it would go up. So no doubt you do improve by doing that, but it does take the pressure off those final exams. And there is no doubt that certainly education traditionalists believe that those final exams, they are better, and they certainly do limit the grade inflation. Now, that's what the government wanted. That was a specific policy decision with an outcome that could be measured. So with this, as you said earlier, Dan, this is unprecedented. I don't think personally that this one-off, as we all hope it is, experience of coronavirus that sort of really hammered 2020, I don't think that will necessarily be repeated in 2021. You know, if a vaccine's available come the start of next year, then we could just be back to where we were. And I think that's certainly what the government would want.
So here's another question from Claire Maddocks McLoughlin. Do you agree with bringing the mocks forward this year to November?
Yeah, I think mocks, certainly, I remember them being held in November. The one thing is, I believe you've got to submit your UCAS applications before that. I think it's October when you've got to submit your application. So the predicted grades for that are what happens. You know, if we bring forward mocks to perhaps before the submission of UCAS forms, that might give a better steer on what pupils are likely to achieve in their actual A-level exams, if they are to sit A-level exams. I mean, there's a case that you don't want to have the mocks too early because you haven't learned enough to be tested on it. You know, if you're doing a Chaucer, and then later you're going to do Shakespeare, you can only obviously be tested on Chaucer if you haven't studied Shakespeare yet. If Shakespeare is going to come afterwards, you know, pick those at random. But that's the sort of the situation you could be having, is you're only going to be tested on one element if you haven't learned the other element, if you haven't learned it yet, obviously.
That's my feeling of it. I mean, clearly I'm a reporter, so it's reporting what other people are saying rather than just having a view myself. But what your question about mocks, Claire, is quite a lot like the issue with the 11 plus, which doesn't exist in most of the country now, but did exist where I went to school. And my experience of it was very much that, it will siphon out some of the brightest kids to go to grammar school, but it will also siphon out the kids whose parents can afford tutoring, private tutoring, and sort of coaching to pass the test. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the 11 plus has been a big issue this year. While all the other exams were delayed, there were some schools still planning to have the 11 plus in September for the year 6 pupils ready to go into year 7 the next year. And the problem with that is the shorter time it is between starting school and having those exams, be they the 11 plus or the mocks for the secondary kids, the bigger the difference between poorer kids who haven't been able to learn at home, who maybe live in a really cramped flat and they haven't got room to sort of study, and the richer kids who maybe have more books and stuff at home, they have more room to kind of have quiet study time and that sort of thing. So it widens that inequality. So there are always going to be problems with bringing forward those mocks. Keep your questions coming, guys. Aha, there's another one. Joshua Pilling, are you worried for the future children and how the government will handle it? Ben, what do you think of this one?
I mean, I can't imagine what it is like if you're a teenager or younger growing up under these circumstances. You know, a lot of kids haven't seen their mates for 5 months now. For several months, they were banned full stop from, going out or meeting up with them. Now they're meeting up with them if their parents can get them there. But they're not seeing them day by day, 29 of your closest friends in the classroom, learning some times tables, and then going out playing hopscotch or football in the playground at lunchtime. I I can't stress how these important years for children, these formative years, it's all right for you and me, Dan, we're doing our jobs, we're working from home, it's largely the same. Kids, there's a very big chunk of their life that has been abnormal, where they've not seen their mates, where they've probably been holed up at home with parents who are struggling to work from home. Some kids obviously would have been in small flats, didn't have access to a garden. And yes, I am worried about how the government will handle it. Again, I stress that I don't even think this is a party political thing. I don't see what Labour, for example, or Liberal Democrats might have done differently, certainly in the initial phases where all the focus was on bringing down the infection rate by people staying home, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. You'll remember that. And you can't argue with that as an initial strategy. But they were taking big decisions that are going to affect the future for children. We've seen some of the figures on domestic violence, that soared. Well, some of these children will have been at home watching their parents fighting, watching domestic violence being perpetrated in the house. I mean, what sort of psychological effect is that going to have on children in the long term? So yes, to answer the question, Joshua, I am worried about the future that children are going to be experiencing. Yeah.
And even in the short term, I'll just say this quickly, it's summed up in a question that one of my fellow journalists put to Gavin Williamson yesterday. If we couldn't trust you to sort out this A-levels mess in the first few days, then how should we trust you to have schools back properly, safely in September? Because the government has said it will be safe, we'll have all pupils back, but there are still issues about what happens if that pushes the R rate above 1, and what happens if there's a second wave, how quickly will they close, or will they keep schools open? So I'm going to move on because we've got about 5 minutes left, I think, before we need to go for a speech by Matt Hancock, of all things. So Eve Von, I hope I pronounced that right, Eve, if you've accepted an offer at uni, will it be taken off you if under the new system people have higher grades than you?
Well, the short answer to that is it shouldn't be. We don't know is the 100% answer at the moment. But what the government has said is that it wants everyone who universities who've made offers and where the grades have been got through the teachers' predictions, that the students should be able to go and take up the place at their university. If that means that people who did get their places at university and then someone gets a higher grade, should they effectively, what you're asking, Yvonne, is leapfrog them? No, they shouldn't, because if you've got your place at university, you should be able to keep that. What the government's done is shift the problem onto the universities, who are today scrambling really to try and get to grips with this system that the government's just foisted upon them. And the university leaders are doing their absolute best to try and make this as pain-free as possible for students. But I was talking to Universities UK this morning, and the deadline for sorting all this is September the 7th. So there's another, 2.5, 3 weeks for children are going to be in a bit of limbo until they get that letter 100% saying, yes, please come and start with us on whatever date it is at Leeds University, at Birmingham, wherever they're going. But this is, it's more chaos for these children, and it must be a very difficult time for them.
If I don't know what situation you're in, but I think if you were accepted into your uni yesterday, last week, in spite of all of this, then you're probably okay. If you had your place rejected on the basis of those downgraded A-levels, there could now be a problem, because some unis went ahead thinking there wouldn't be a U-turn and offered some of those places to pupils with clearing and that sort of thing. And the government has asked the universities to accept everyone who would have got a place, but ultimately it's up to the individual university. So if this is a problem personal to you, you need to ring up the uni and say, look, I've got the grades now, or my son or daughter has got the grades now. Please sort this out.
The other thing that's important to stress, I think, is that it sort of got lost a little bit yesterday, but Gavin Williamson did say they've lifted the cap on the numbers that universities can accept. Now, to a certain extent, that is just putting the problem back on the universities, because the government's going to say, well, it's not our fault, you can take as many as you like, right? But Dan's point earlier, that universities are going to have problems about social distancing and the rules around, you know, bubbling with people on your course, with your household. I mean, many universities are trying to make it so that you live with people from your course rather than you live with randoms who aren't on your course, so you try and limit the number of people that students come into contact with. But it is a problem for universities to struggle with over the next couple of weeks. Right, well, I think that looks like we should be wrapping up now, Dan. Thank you everyone for joining us. I've enjoyed that, and hopefully we've been able to answer some of your questions, but thank you.
Yeah, we'll hopefully perhaps do it again soon when we actually have some more answers ourselves on uni. But good luck everyone, and